Okay, welcome to the final week of Fine Arts Visual, week 6, where we will be looking at 20th century art and contemporary art, meaning art made up until today. So, this covers chapters 14, 15, 16, and a little bit of chapter 21. So, we'll just take a look real quick. This is everything that you need to know for chapter 14. So, we have images from Picasso on page 376 and 377. That's right at the beginning of the chapter. So these are all the sections you need to read. 378, the global upheaval and artistic revolution. On 380, read about German Expressionism. 381, you'll read about Kandinsky. And then 382, Kathy Kollwitz. 383 and 384, read about Cubism, Purism, Analytic Cubism, and Synthetic Cubism. 384, really important image of 20th century art is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, so you'll read about that. 386, read about Dada, that's a fun one. 387, you'll read about that work by Boccaccini. 394, Surrealism. And 396, Oppenheim's Object. 400, Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, that's a photograph, and page 401, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, another famous image from the 20th century. So you're going to see a lot of artwork that, again, just like last week, you are going to recognize a lot of this work. So at this time, there's many dynamic centers of modernism. So Paris is like the center of the art world. Brussels, Munich, Venice. This is all happening while there's an explosion of knowledge happening, right? Think about at this time, Einstein is working, Freud is working on psychoanalysis. So there's just all sorts of things happening around the world, and this created a lot of tensions, right? There are new ways of questioning reality that were coming up, and so artists were the ones that had to find ways to deal with that. As the old world orders collapsed, they were replaced by new things, right? Like capitalism and communism, and as always, artists were trying to make sense of these changes. The relentless questioning of the status quo gave rise to the name avant-garde, right? Which is a French term that just means front guard, and it derives from the French military, where troops were sent ahead of the main military body. So these politicians and poets and artists that we're looking at thought of themselves as like a progressive front that was moving out beyond the main population. They rejected traditional ideas in academic art, and so we're entering a period where art really has to be explained because the general public will not understand it, and that's where all these isms come from as ways to sort of simplify what was happening in this group of artists or that group of artists. So one of the first ones we look at is Fauvism. Matisse was the dominant figure of the Fauve group, and the Fauves were called this because they were like wild animals, right? That term refers to being a wild animal. So they used color wildly, really bright colors. And so again, Matisse is an artist that you'll look at in this chapter. Really, the big one that changed everyone's view of everything was Picasso and Cubism. And for many years, Picasso didn't show this sort of work to people. He kept it to himself. It was very differently. And he worked with one artist named George Braque. And they together developed analytic cubism, which totally rejected realistic depictions and illusion, all these things that had really been established in art since the Renaissance. Even the artists that we looked at last week still had a sense of space and form and sense of illusion, even though it was altered in some way. So they really developed this completely new way where they would look at an object and sort of look at it from multiple different points of view and put it together on one image. They really transformed reality into optical features, so shapes and angles, and they recomposed it into one coherent aesthetic object. And then as time went on, Picasso took this idea of cubism further and reintroduced figuration into it, and developed Guernica, right? And this was Picasso's response to the Nazi bombing of the Basque region of Spain in 1937. And in that image, he really depicted all the horrors he saw. You know, you can see in there people screaming, horses screaming. I mean, it was, and this is a massive painting that really depicts what happened, you know, or his feelings about what happened. So you'll read about that in the book a little bit more. And Picasso and many of these other modern artists started looking at, they were influenced by art other than Western art. So they weren't just looking back to the Renaissance and stuff like that. They were looking all over the world, right? At this point, technology had gotten good enough where people could really see artwork from all over the world, from cultures they weren't used to. And Picasso in particular was really influenced by African art and African masks, and how strange they were to him, you know, coming from a Western traditional education where he was really seeing mostly only illusionistic art. This is why this chapter 21 has been added in there. There's just a few things for you to look at. So African art, where you can get at least a sense. It would be nice if we could spend a little bit more time actually talking more about that, but there's just so much art to talk about and so little time in this compressed class. So this brings us to this, right? There's two images, right? 561, the waist pendant of Queen Mother Ida, and then 568, Art Society African Masquerades, where you actually read about what those masks meant in their cultural context. The next real big ism isn't quite an ism in itself, a Dadaism sometimes, but Dada, it was a really, honestly, strange movement, intentionally strange, right? It began in Europe after World War One. And they believed that Enlightenment reasoning was responsible for the destruction of World War One. So they just rejected everything. They were contrarians. They whatever you said, they said the opposite. Right? And this is kind of summed up in their mantra that you see written down here. And Dada knows everything. Dada spits on everything. Dada says nothing. Dada has no fixed ideas. Dada is bitterness, laughing at everything that has been accomplished. Dada is never right. No more painters, no more religions, no more royalists, no more anarchists, no more socialists, no more police, no more airplanes, no more urinary passages. We'll get to that in a second. We are incapable of treating seriously any subject whatsoever, let alone this subject ourselves. So they really took in the absurd, right? They were absolutely absurd. And Dada did not really think of itself as art. It was anti-art. Everything for which art stood, Dada represented the opposite. If art was supposed to be concerned with beauty and aesthetics, right, like many of the traditional Western artists had come to believe, Dada ignored that. It was intended to offend, right? So they did things intentionally, right? You'll read about Duchamp's fountain, right, where there's a urinal that's turned on its side, right, and showed that as art. It was intentionally meant to irritate people, really, quite honestly. And again, like, this was their response to just the absolute horrors of World War One, which was a brutal war where people were senselessly killed on a level not seen before, because we didn't have that sort of technology until World War One. One of the other isms that came out of this was surrealism. Surrealists were sort of related to the Dadaists, but a little bit more focused on dreams and expression, and really influenced by the work of Freud and the unconscious. So they were determined to explore ways to express in art the world of dreams and of the unconscious. So they weren't quite as contrarian, but definitely still quite weird, as you can see with this cup here made out of hair, which again you read about in your textbook. So chapter 15, right? So you read about the aftermath of World War II, which again was really a continuation of World War I. And World War I and World War II were just traumatic to essentially everyone living on the planet. Everyone that had to partake in that was traumatized, and we see that in evidence in the art. You read about Giacometti, his man pointing on page 413, and abstract expressionism, which is also on 413. Jackson Pollock, I'm sure everyone knows Pollock's work, 415. 416, William de Kooning, Mark Rothko, right? These are all abstract expressionists that came out of World War II. Bridget Riley, Fission, on page 418. Also on 416, post-painterly abstraction. On 420, read about pop art, so Andy Warhol and an artist like that. 421, Art and Society, read more about pop art there. And then about Richard Hamilton, who, just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing, right? A collage piece. Roy Lichtenstein, Hopeless, on page 423. On page 424, you read about superrealism, which came out of pop art. 427, Judy Chicago, The Dinner Party, feminist art. 433, Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty, that's environmental art. And Joseph Kosuth, 1 and 3 chairs, which is conceptual art. So let's go back a step, right, and talk about abstract expressionism. One of the most famous abstract expressionists alongside Pollock was Mark Rothko. Was an abstract expressionist. And the specific type of paintings that he made are called color field paintings. So color in these cases served as the primary conveyor of meaning, and he only painted with gradations of colors. He said that he realized that historically the function of painting large pictures is painting something very grandiose and pompous. He goes on to say, the reason I paint them, however, is precisely because I want to be very intimate and human. To paint a small picture is to place yourself outside your experience, to look upon an experience as a stereoptician view with a reducing glass. Right, this is a little outdated, but essentially looking at this with a magnifying glass or something like that. Going back to his quote, however, you paint the large picture. When you paint the larger picture, you are in it. It isn't something you command. So his idea was to paint these very simple paintings, but make them very large. And they are huge. They're 20, 30, 40 feet tall at times. They're massive paintings. And his idea was to make something that was intimate and transcendent. We can go to the next one, right? In all the color field painters, there's a couple other you'll look at. They saw the surface of the canvas as a field of vision without a focal point. This method of painting emphasized the flatness of the surface. And again, it was about expression, about revealing the artist's state of mind through colors, and not about illusion like Renaissance art. So this was radical, absolutely radical at the time. Now we kind of look at it and don't think much of it. But at the time, this was a really radical idea to put this in front of somebody and ask them to think about it. And again, very, very large canvases. You can see that's probably one of like the smaller ones, quite frankly, where you see that this person standing next to the Rothko painting, right? I mean, that's probably 12 feet tall at least. They were meant to be like pieces for meditation in Rothko's mind. Another abstract expressionist is Jackson Pollock. Sure, many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with some of his work. And again, the specific type of abstract expressionism that Jackson Pollock practiced is called action painting. And action painting is literally the painting of the action of the human movement, right? So this was coined by Rosenberg, a art critic, and gave it the title action painting because it shows the movement of the artist, right? It records the action of the painting, and you'll read more about this on page 415. Pop art, right, which was a response to all of the fancy, very high-end art. it challenged high art and instead focused on popular culture, right? So that's where pop art comes from, like pop music. Um, and this reflected the 1960s move away from traditional art, and pop artists really spent a lot of time thinking about what uh, is considered lowbrow art, right? So they were influenced by comics, like, as you can see in this Lichtenstein image here, which you read about in your book. Looking at comic books and deliberately taking that and then trying to turn it into high art. So they were questioning and challenging what was considered, the expensive art and what was considered something that you would put in, a Sunday newspaper. Another artist that did this is Andy Warhol, again, very famous artist that you're probably familiar with. Andy Warhol was really got famous for using screen printing to make images. And at the time, screen printing was really just a way of producing T-shirts and clothes and printed images, posters in industry, right? So it was an industrial material and not something that you would use to make high art. It was something just to produce images at a large scale. And Andy Warhol said, I'll take that, I'll make art out of it. And not only will I make art of that, I'll use consumer culture as my subject. So he printed images of Marilyn Monroe and Coke cans. And so that became his subject. Now, out of pop art came super realist. And now I know at first glance that doesn't make any sense, but the pop artists were trying to find ways to make art that spoke to people, right? After the beginning of modernism and Picasso's art and Dada, which really fought against people, the general public, right? As I said at the beginning of this, where the general public couldn't really understand it, pop artists wanted to sort of return to the everyday man and give them images that they were sort of familiar with, like comic books, right? Or images of Coke cans or Marilyn Monroe, who they would see in movies and stuff like that. So similarly, the super realists, right, like Chuck Close, this image by Chuck Close here, they wanted something that could speak to the general public, that was accessible. So this was really a response to the artwork that was being made, prior at the beginning of the 20th century. That unfamiliar visual language of post-war abstractions like Jackson Pollock's paintings, which, again, at the time we don't think much of it, but during the 50s when that artwork was coming out, that was radical artwork that most people didn't think much of. But they looked at an image like this and said, wow, that's drawn with charcoal. That's amazing. It was something that it connected the regular person. It still to this day connects the regular everyday person to artwork. Now, going back to artwork inspired by the Dadaists is feminist art. And feminist art is what it sounds like, right, based off feminism. But feminism as a philosophy really questioned a lot of, again, the overriding rules that have been governing cultures for centuries. And because of that, they were also going to question the art world, right? Renaissance-based artwork, Western traditional artwork, where you have an illusion and a sense of space and perspective and all that, was made by men. So why continue those? So feminists really challenged that and built installations and like work that's kind of hard to place, right? It's sort of sculptural, but it's sort of like a whole piece in itself, right? It's this whole thing. So you read about the Dinner Party, and it's acknowledged as a masterpiece of feminist art. This was made by Judy Chicago, and again, you'll read about this on page 427. But each plate has a little sculpture on it. So it's considered one piece, even though it's made up of a whole bunch of pieces, right? And it's shown in this triangular form, right, representing the womanly parts, if you will. So chapter 16, moving on. You see here the images that you need to know and the sections to read, right? So again, we're based off what we were just talking about with Judy Chicago's work, right? We're going to get a lot more into controversial subjects as artwork today is doing, right? This is the later half of the 20th century into today, right? So the beginning of the 21st century. So you can see artwork from Jane Quick to C. Smith, right? A trade. This is from an indigenous artist on page 438. 439, art as socio-political message, right? Which is probably, if you've paid attention to a lot of contemporary art in the last, even 40 years or so, that has really become what mainstream popular contemporary art is always about, is a socio-political message. As well as personal and group identity, right? So you read about that on page 440. One image also on 440 that you will read about is by Jean-Michel Basquiat, Horn Players. Page 442, read about gender and sexuality as it refers to art. And then Barbara Kruger, her work Untitled, another very famous and influential feminist artist. On page 443, read about art and society, public funding of controversial art. Again, that's something that comes up time and time again. Page 444, national identity, and then read about the Holy Virgin Mary by Chris Offolini. 448, representation and abstraction, figural painting and sculpture. So you can read about the artist Jenny Saville, a contemporary figurative painter that's working today. So we finally kind of talking about artists working today, along with Jeff Koons, another very famous artist that you may have heard of, on page 449. Read about his sculpture Pink Panther, but you might also have seen Jeff Koons' artwork, like his gigantic metal balloon dogs. Again, his artwork is kind of all over the place and has been for the past 10, 15 years or so. And then finally, on page 455, Art and Society, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. And so read about that, understand the image, but that artwork actually ended up being destroyed, right, being removed. So read about that controversy, because Richard Serra really tried to make a splash, let's say, with his that sculpture. So read about that on page 455. And you can see it here. That it cut through a major courtyard, and immediately the public hated it and demanded that it had to be removed. So this is sort of also tied to the public funding of art, because this was publicly funded. So there's a lot to read, and I know that you guys have been going through this class, with a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm going to keep this short and just give you a few hints of what you need to know here. So know the artists and titles of these images, right? Picasso's Guernica, right? There's the artist and title, Picasso, Guernica. Again, that's on page 384. Giacometti's Pointing Man on page 413. The Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson on page 433. And then Jean-Michel Basquiat on page 440, right? Know those artists, know those titles. And then know the styles here. So we talked about analytic cubism with Picasso on page 383. Talked about action painting with Jackson Pollock on page 415. Surrealism, that's on page 394. And finally, conceptual art on page 434. So read about those. Again, go through your lecture notes. Read about all the images, know the styles, know the artists, know the titles, read the context surrounding those images, and do the summary paper and your quiz. And that'll bring us pretty much to a close. The only thing you'll have to do after that is, once this week has closed, the post-test exam will open up, and you'll have a week to complete that. Don't worry about that too much. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy, and you get credit just for doing it. So don't worry about it too much. So thank you guys. It's been a fun class, and good luck on your quiz and on your summary paper.